I love maps, and I have always loved maps. As a kid, I would send letters to tourist bureaus in other states, and sometimes they reward me with a map. My biggest prize, literally, was a map of Texas as big as my bedspread. I pored over that map and all the others that I received, and I studied them like scripture. I drew my own maps in imitation, and later, when I got into role-playing games, I drew up maps of my game worlds that might have fit in a World Book atlas. Grown-up life kept me from pestering the tourist bureaus anymore, but I never lost my interest in maps. So after the kids were grown and my small business was starting to afford me a little extra time and a little extra money, I was quick to decide to take up map collecting as a hobby. I started by just browsing the internet and checking out eBay dealers. I'm cautious with my money, and I didn't buy anything right away. But then I saw this beauty, and I knew it was time to get serious. The map stood out in part just due to the hatching, which is somewhat unusual in maps of any vintage, but it was the subject that excited me. It showed a portion of Africa in a time when only the fringes of the continent were at all explored. I was immediately taken with images from pulpy stories like King Solomon's Mines or The Lost World or Journey to the Center of the Earth. It was a childish notion, but suddenly, to me, the price was irrelevant. I couldn't wait to get my hands on what had to be a real-life treasure map. And when it finally arrived and I could examine it in detail, I found out that it had secrets I could have scarcely guessed at. Stick with this video to the end. There is an amazing secret hidden in plain sight, and after I reveal it to you, you'll understand why I've been an avid map collector ever since. Welcome to the Eye of History. Here we explore the world through maps, gaining new perspectives on history, culture, economics, technology, science, and more. And if that sounds interesting to you, stick around and remember to like, share, and subscribe. It really helps nerdy channels like this one. So imagine yourself in 1805, finding this map in your Arrowsmith and Lewis new and elegant atlas. To keep your eye from wandering all over this fascinating map, I'll bring your focus to one key place, here on the western coast. We see the Isle of St. Louis, the infamous French slave market. Up the Senegal River to the lands of the Fula. There are light-skinned people who once ruled a great empire. Now their origins are a riddle. To Carta, a new empire of pagan slavers, now grown rich, supplying slaves to European ships and Muslim caravans alike. And to a new river, in the Bambara, another pagan empire built on the rubble of their Manding ancestors. What few rumors have reached Europe say that it's an empire ruled by whispers, secret societies prowling temple and palace. The river grows and we realize it's the Niger, for 2,000 years the subject of legends told in distant Greece and Rome. The ancients believed that the Niger flowed into the distant Nile, but recently some have begun to believe that it's really the same river as the Congo. No one knows for sure. And finally, to the prize. Glorious Timbuktu, the true city of gold, the Mecca of Africa, once the home of Mansa Musa, said to be the richest man in history, and now a byword for the exotic, the opulent, the remote, and the unobtainable. The child in me saw it at once. This is just like a treasure map. Yet this map had a cultural importance even greater than the treasure of Timbuktu. This map and its maker changed the way maps were drawn for generations. Aaron Arrowsmith started his career as a surveyor and a hydrographer, that is, a surveyor of the sea and coast. Although British, he was also very popular in the United States, where his atlases were reprinted by multiple publishers. What separated Arrowsmith from other map makers was not just his exactitude, cartographic habits learned from making sea charts, but his spare and objective presentation. His maps were less artistic and more scientific. He didn't aim to be complete, he aimed to be right. To see how different Arrowsmith was, we have to look at how his predecessors operated. Before Arrowsmith, the style was to fill in all the blank spaces. In the 16th and early 17th century, in what I call the Baroque era of mapmaking, this often meant filling the spaces with artwork. But usually it was with old, conjectural ideas, often drawn from classical sources like Strabo and Ptolemy. Kingdoms and peoples from Roman history show up in maps all the way through the 18th century. And to these were added new legends based on the garbled accounts of traders, slaves, or missionaries. Cartographers filled in every blank space, as though they feared that no one would buy a map from a mapmaker who didn't know what was in the place, or of a place where there wasn't anything worth mapping. Arrowsmith's style, leaving empty and unexplored areas relatively blank, was a fresh idea. You might think that this was due to Arrowsmith's training as a hydrographer. With sea charts, a bad sounding is worse than no sounding at all. But hold on to that thought. There is a deeper reason, which we'll get into later. Arrowsmith kept to this style, and with his success, this became a cartographic standard for the next century. Here we see a map in which the Sahara is appropriately empty, marked by caravan routes laid straight like the courses of ships. And here is a map of Central West Africa in which nothing which had not been systematically explored is depicted whatsoever. There were other cartographers in Arrowsmith's time that were also working towards a more precise style, but Arrowsmith was the most influential by far. But let's see how well Arrowsmith did at living up to his own standard. Did his exactitude match his ambitions? We'll start here in the south end of the map, in the Gulf of Guinea. Here he is very restrained, depicting just the coast and a few interior rivers which we can assume were known through their use by traders in the region. The names of native kingdoms should sound familiar. All were real kingdoms and are located reasonably well. In this area, I believe Arrowsmith was successful. He refused to show greater detail than his sources could support, and everything appears to be reasonably accurate. Now to the other end of the map, the Maghreb, what is now Morocco and Algeria. Given the proximity to Europe and ongoing trade and diplomacy, we would expect that the Maghreb would be accurately represented. The coasts, of course, are easily verified, but as we move south across the Atlas Mountains, it becomes much more difficult. For example, Arrowsmith has a tribe he calls the Hanselmenes. I believe that this refers to the Hassaniya, a major Arabic tribe known in the general region, so we'll give him credit for this. A modest distance away, he places the oasis city of Tata, known as the Pink City for its pink-tinted mud houses. It's about 2 degrees or 130 miles too far south. That's a little surprising, and shows that he was still working from stories, not surveys. He also places Tata in a district called Dara, which I can't identify at all. Of course, that may speak more about how thin our sources are today. It's possible that Arrowsmith had access to information that we have since lost. But it's just to the east, in Sigil Missa, that we catch him in an overt error. Sigil Missa had once been a major oasis entrepot, the terminus of a key caravan route, but the city had faded as cargoes shifted from camelbacks to the hulls of Atlantic ships, and the desert encroached upon the wadis. By 1800, Sigil Missa was a ruin, barely occupied. Here Arrowsmith was not entirely wrong, just very out of date. Interesting, in at least one spot, Arrowsmith lapses into a bit of poetry. Here he labels the oasis-blessed region south of Algiers the country of dates. It's an apt description for sure, but not the sort of label we would expect in a serious map. Finally, we have Gualada, a caravan city almost as famous in that time as Timbuktu. Arrowsmith seems unwilling to locate it precisely. He applies the name to an entire region. That was just as well. He's way off on the location, about 500 miles too far north. Still, almost any other mapmaker of that time would have tried to place Gualada precisely, and precisely wrong. I might mention that Timbuktu was also misplaced, but only by about half as much, and only in longitude, which is much harder to determine. So for the Maghreb and Sahara, we'll give them mixed marks. There is one cute detail here on the Gulf of Sidra on the Mediterranean shore. This area is marked quicksand. Here, Arrowsmith is guilty of misunderstanding a passage of the Bible, or perhaps a passage from the Roman writer Apollonius Rhodius. In Acts 27:17, Apostle Paul was on board a ship sailing in the Gulf of Sidra when a storm arose, and, quote, because they were afraid they would run aground on the sandbars of Syrtis, they lowered the sea anchor and let the ship be driven along. The Gulf of Sidra had been known since Roman times for its shallow shoals, which Arrowsmith seems to have mistaken for a terrestrial phenomenon. This seems strange, as Arrowsmith was a hydrologist, a maker of sea charts, as well as a cartographer. Most likely he was simply copying some earlier map, although I haven't been able to track his source down. Finally, we turn to the central region of the map, the same area that we looked at earlier. Here it becomes very difficult to evaluate. The tribes and kingdoms that Arrowsmith named certainly existed, but we are today on no firmer ground than Arrowsmith was in stating their extents at that time. I expect that much of Arrowsmith's information was outdated and much was misplaced, but it might still be better than the information that we have today on that era. There's an interesting detail that Arrowsmith adds just in this part of the map. Here, Arrowsmith demarks boundaries between states. He doesn't do that in the Maghreb, except in one spot, the boundary between Tunis and Algiers. That boundary would have been easy for Arrowsmith to draw, but here we have boundaries between states for which Arrowsmith had only the sketchiest of data. It's uncharacteristic of our hero, and I believe that Arrowsmith had a specific agenda in mind when he did this. Remember that the year is 1805, that Arrowsmith was an Englishman, and the most important topic in British politics at the moment was the question of slavery. The Slave Trade Act, which ended the slave trade in British territories and on British ships, was being hotly debated. Arrowsmith was a committed abolitionist, and I believe that it suited him to portray these African states as fully realized nations on a par with Britain. Support for the slave trade fed on the idea that the slaves themselves were tribal primitives who perhaps benefited from being lifted out of ignorance and brought into Christian civilization. By drawing the interior states so explicitly, Arrowsmith sought to refute this premise, portraying the victims of slavery as being civilized in the place of their own birth. It is worth noting that he did not draw boundaries around the coastal kingdoms like Ashanti and Dahomey, I suppose because any such lines could easily be disputed by people on the pro-slavery side. But he had greater freedom in Mali, and no one at the time could second-guess where he drew those lines. So here we have to say that Arrowsmith did not live up to his ideal of keeping to reality. He was apparently willing to abandon his objectivity to advance a personal ideal. He wasn't the first, and he certainly wasn't the last to do so. It's one reason why I find maps so fascinating. They reveal not just how people saw the world, but how they wanted others to see the world as well. Thank you for sticking with me. The payoff is almost here. You see, this map is actually a detail taken from Arrowsmith's masterpiece, his huge 1802 map of Africa. This was a huge map, even bigger than that map of Texas I loved as a kid, and was immediately hailed as the definitive map of Africa at the time. Many today consider it the greatest map of the Enlightenment. Arrowsmith dedicated the map to the British Association for Promoting the Discovery of the Interior Parts of Africa. Better known as the African Association, this was a cadre of leading intellectuals and philanthropists that backed most of the great expeditions into the Dark Continent. The head of the African Association was also head of the Royal Society and the most influential naturalist in Britain, Sir Joseph Banks. And like Arrowsmith, Banks and most of the African Association were fervent abolitionists. They were sure that as knowledge of Africa grew, so would opportunities for trade in commodities other than human bodies, and the slave trade would wither away. The degree to which the exploration of Africa was motivated not by the search for slaves, but by the abhorrence of slavery is, I think, underappreciated today. As I said before, This map is still praised today for its scientific restraint, avoiding conjecture and leaving the unexplored areas nearly blank. As we saw earlier, it set the standard for map makers that held through the next century. But it turns out that was never Arrowsmith's intent. This map was Arrowsmith's challenge to the African Association and the explorers it funded. It all but screams, "Get busy and fill in these blanks." And as for Timbuktu, it turns out, at the time Arrowsmith was creating this map, no European had yet reached the legendary city. Arrowsmith did not intend this map to be a conventional record of previous explorations. This map was meant to lead future explorers to the most thrilling goal imaginable. Timbuktu was an incredible treasure, and this was the treasure map to find it. So it seems that my childish notion was correct. This is a treasure map. Yet it just so happens that in challenging the explorers of his time, Arrowsmith accidentally inspired cartographers to change how they depicted the world, to be more grounded, skeptical, scientific. It wasn't his intention, but it was an immense contribution to the world, and it is what he's remembered for today. The way history can turn on such serendipity always amazes and amuses me. I hope that you are amused as well. Now to the appraisal. For collectors, this is one of the most criminally underappreciated maps out there. Some Arrowsmith maps are among the most sought after of the 19th century. Some sell for tens of thousands of dollars. That 4-panel 1802 original is among them. But the detail maps that were published in Arrowsmith's atlases get much less attention, even though they can be hard to find as well. Their value varies considerably according to their subject, as well as the usual considerations of condition, edition, and coloring. If my map was in pristine condition, I suspect that it would sell for $300 to $500. Sadly, it's not, as there's quite a bit of foxing on the page. The discoloration is common in old books and prints and fairly harmless. It can be caused by moisture, fungus, or acidic reactions in the paper, which is why I always keep my maps in archival folders. But unfortunately for this map, the damage has already been done. Thus, it's a good thing that I bought it fairly cheaply, so even though the foxing cuts the value probably about half, I did all right on the purchase. Objectively, it wasn't a bargain, but subjectively, I got a treasure that's worth more to me than all the gold in Timbuktu. I hope you enjoyed my tale of treasure maps. If you did, then please like and subscribe, and check out one of the other videos from the Eye of History.